From the National Catholic Register, this is Register Radio, bringing light and clarity to the news and topics that affect your life.
The German bishops met this week expecting to vote on the controversial statutes of the German synodal way, but the vote didn't happen thanks to the Vatican's intervention. Does this effectively derail the progressive agenda being pushed by the German synodal way? CNA Deutsch editor-in-chief A.C. Wimmer reports the story. Then we look at the influential role of women in the Catholic Church. No, not in the German church today, or no, not in the U.S. parish or diocesan life, or even at the Vatican, but we look all the way back to the Middle Ages, and we see the feminine genius at work more than 1,000 years ago. The Register's European correspondent Solène Tadié joins us. I'm Jeanette DeMello, Executive Director of the National Catholic Register and your host here of Register Radio. I'm joined by my co-host Matthew Bunson, who is EWTN News' Vice President and Editorial Director. We're sitting together, which is unusual, in the Guadalupe radio studio at EWTN News' Washington Bureau. We've also got A.C. Wimmer with us, which is just even more of a delight because there are three of us in the same room.
Well, this is a splendidly European episode of Register Radio.
That's true. We have Solène and Christophe. It's just it's a treasure to be here together. And of course, there was a bit of news this week. We were talking about women in the life of the church in the next segment, but this one is based on some news that just happened. Basically, the Central Committee of German Catholics, a lay-run lobby group, if you want, had previously approved the statutes of the German synodal way last November. And the German bishops who were meeting in their spring plenary session were expected to discuss and to vote on those this week, and that didn't happen. And so A.C. Wimmer, we're very happy to have you here to talk about this news because it's a bit confusing as to why it didn't happen. We do know that the bishops received a letter from the Vatican asking them not to vote. What were they going to vote on, and what happened?
Yeah. First off, pleasure to be here and in person. I'm really enjoying that. Thank you so much. Look, the situation is a bit complicated, you're right. So the German synodal way, which has been going on since 2019, is meant to be turned into a kind of permanent body to oversee the church in Germany. And that is, it's going to be called the Synodal Council, is meant to be brought about using the statutes of a synodal committee. It's all done with a lot of German thoroughness. And the issue around that, of course, is that the Vatican, who's intervened repeatedly, has now said, look, if you're going to do that, you're really crossing a kind of red line here. And it is in particular within the sacramental structure of the church that red line is to be found. And interventions have come not only from the Vatican, of course, and concerned bishops around the world, but now two very important German language cardinals who are not necessarily considered the most conservative either, which is Cardinal Christoph Schönborn,
That's right,
Archbishop of Vienna, and Walter Kasper, well-known theologian and advisor to Pope Francis. So that shows you that really, what's at stake here is a huge concern, not only to the Pope, to the Vatican and the global church, but even those who are perhaps reform-minded bishops.
And really, one of the things they're saying, just to kind of put a point on something you said, is all of this criticism or all of the Vatican's intervention has basically been to say, this isn't your domain. German church, you cannot decide a new church structure. And Indeed. That's an important point. And we're not actually talking about hot-button issues related to social issues of our day. This is actually something even more fundamental. And that's important for us to really grasp because we've heard the arguments over, women in the church or same-sex blessings, which we've been talking about ad nauseum for months now. This is fundamentally about the structure of the church, and that is very important for us to recognize. So the question becomes, was this intervention a hard stop? Where is this going? Is this just a pause in the efforts of the German synodal way?
Spot on. I think that really is the question because, as you said, what's at stake here really is the overall process. You've got this ecclesiologically baffling model of a non-synod, a synodal way. And the question really is, why did the German bishops depart down that particular path all those years ago? and where are they going to really end up? If this is a stay, if this is a sort of a reprieve from a process that will still take place, which I think a lot of observers are expecting, the German bishops and the Central Committee of German Catholics that you mentioned, I think are still going to try and pursue those objectives, then there will be at stake what was, started not only many years ago, but also several $1 million ago.
Wow.
At some estimates, certainly more than $5 million ago. And with a lot of contentious stuff coming up that perhaps has been brought to light, but not really been found to be acceptable to a lot of Catholics, but perhaps even more bafflingly or alarmingly, was not really in the interest to a majority of German Catholics, because according to some surveys, they were not really interested in this kind of process. And of course, as Pope Francis has raised, the process itself, the synodal way, was not about evangelization, the one thing that he really wanted them to do in a letter that he wrote to the German Catholics back in 2019.
You're telling me this is driven by some elites?
Well, we're listening to the Holy Father's words, aren't we? I mean, he has brought that up, but yes. So that is one of the most pronounced and arguably hard to refute criticisms, of course.
The Holy Father's used the phrase, it is elitist and unhelpful.
Yes.
You used the phrase, though, that this is similar to something that Goethe and the Sorcerer's Apprentice. What did you mean by that?
Yeah. So for those who don't know Goethe's poem about the Sorcerer's Apprentice, they might know the famous movie by Disney, Fantasia. It's based on that story, and with Mickey Mouse being the sorcerer, which is a wonderful story. But yeah,
that might be an appropriate analogy here.
I'd like to think so, really.
The Mickey Mouse part in particular.
That too, yes. Take it for what you will. So this Sorcerer's Apprentice, he calls on the ghosts that he can no longer then contain. So it's about creating a circumstance within which you find yourself afterwards that you cannot control. The German bishops might well reflect on that being the case right now, given the partnership that they've started with the Central Committee of German Catholics, that lay body, which is very powerful, but also made up of, yes, very important, some might say elitist functionaries, in particular professional politicians, reflecting some of the social and political landscape of the Federal Republic of Germany, for all the sort of problems that might throw up. We're talking about the challenge of a church-state relationship. We're talking about the whole complicated history of German politics and church relationships, the concordats, the church tax system, all of that plays into this here. And that is why Pope Francis and others have said this in particular should have been addressed from the outset and is dangling over the whole thing just as it has all along, like a Damocles sword.
This is Register Radio. We're on EWTN, and we are talking. I'm Jeanette DeMello, and I'm with Matthew Bunson and A.C. Wimmer, and we are talking about the German bishops who were expected to vote on some of the statutes of the German synodal way, particularly the synodal council, this permanent body that would take over governance of the German church. And the Vatican put a stop to it, and there were two prominent church figures, long-time church figures, who spoke out. You mentioned them before, Cardinal Kasper and Cardinal Schönborn. What did they have to say? Why are they speaking up now? Have they spoken out before?
So I think the more alarming, perhaps, words that were used by Cardinal Schönborn, namely threat of a schism of division, which also Pope Francis has raised, and of course a number of the other critics that we've heard throughout the years, may even pale in comparison to the kind of language that we saw from Cardinal Kasper and have seen for a number of years, in particular when it comes to the word synodal council. Because Cardinal Kasper pointed out in earlier criticisms that council in German Rat, the synodaler Rat is the expression, is the same word that you would use for a Soviet. That also means council. And he clearly alludes hereby, of course, to a structure that is not commensurate with the sacramental structure of the church, but also in particular has a sort of totalitarian flavor to it.
Interesting.
So that is, a very strong criticism from someone who otherwise has been very supportive of some of the reform points that have been raised, not only through the synodal way, but also through the pontificate, throughout the pontificate, in Amoris Laetitia and in other documents.
It's interesting because that's not the way you really hear those of the German, I forget the name here, but the German Committee of lay Catholics who've been spearheading that. That's not the way that they usually talk about it. they make it sound as though this is coming from the people, that this is a way of decentralizing the church so that it can be more in touch with where people are. But then you hear this criticism from a German cardinal who says, no, this actually does have a totalitarian stance to it, emphasis to it. How can you make sense of that to us? What is this disconnect here?
Well, I'm afraid I really can't.
Okay.
No, but the baffling side of it, of course, is as you said to your point, Jeanette, there is a number of issues here that have been brought to light, that have been discussed, for instance, also at the Synod of Synodality of the Church in Rome, the Bishop's Synod, with a view to the role of women in church, something you'll be hearing more about in today's program, with a view to some of the participation of lay people in the structures of the church. The question is, why has it run afoul of things because of this process? Really raises the question that I sort of alluded to before. Why did they go about coming up with this process sui generis? Why did they marry the German bishops, that is, the process to the Central Committee and its efforts? There may have well been an opportunity here that may well have been, in fact, squandered for reform orientation. And some of the supporters of changes have pointed out that, we're kind of losing sight of what we want to achieve. Now, look, there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of semantics around the sort of resolutions that have been passed, the debates that have taken place at these assemblies that were part of the synodal way. So there have been efforts to justify it as something that may be evangelizing or otherwise relevant. But the premise on which it was originally based, and I think that's a very important point, is an abuse study, and a study into sexual abuse, historical clerical sexual abuse in Germany. And the assumptions that were drawn from that already were heavily criticized by experts, both Catholic and medical experts, because there were sort of foregone conclusions baked into the whole thing, according to those critics. So it's not only just the process itself, it's also how it was set up. And this is something that Pope Francis in the letter in 2019 raised. This is something the critics have come up with again and again, but it was not addressed. So the answer is, we're not sure why it wasn't addressed. I guess, there's the image of the can being kicked down the road sort of thing. There's something that's been kicked down the road. It's cost a lot of money and effort.
Right.
A lot of people had to be involved and a lot of justifications found. To undo that, again, there's the image of that sorcerer's apprentice. You've unleashed
Pandora's
forces
box.
you cannot control. One of the most interesting questions around it, of course, then is, how will this dovetail? Can it dovetail with the Synod on synodality, or can it, in fact, jeopardize some of the things that have been brought about at that event? How will it affect Rome and the wider universal church?
Well, I think we do expect that there will be a gathering in Rome soon at the Vatican of some of those involved, both the German bishops as well as the lay committee. And so we'll look forward to that. We'll be in touch with you on that to help bring us that reporting. Thank you for what you've reported now.
Thank you.
When we come back, we'll talk to the Register's Solène Tadié about women and the Catholic Church in medieval times. This is Register Radio on EWTN. Stay tuned for more.
Sacrifice is a profound virtue Catholics can lovingly embrace, especially during Lent. But this year, why not also indulge in something good for your soul? Give yourself the gift of EWTN's National Catholic Register and stay connected to the latest developments and historical traditions of our Catholic faith. Save half off your subscription today. Get the National Catholic Register delivered to your home, office, or parish, filled with spiritual insights on world events, along with compelling Catholic news and information. To get 50% off your subscription, order online at ncregister.com/radio or call 800-421-3230 and mention code RADIO. The National Catholic Register. It's the one indulgence you won't ever want to give up. Call or click today to save half off. The National Catholic Register. Read faithfully.
Let's return to Register Radio on EWTN.
I'm Jeanette DeMello, Executive Director of the National Catholic Register and Catholic News Agency, and your host here on Register Radio. I'm joined by my co-host Matthew Bunson, who is EWTN News' Vice President and Editorial Director. And we've all heard the term, the pejorative expression, that it's so medieval. That's so medieval, to describe something old-fashioned or antiquated or primitive. You've probably heard it in connection with the church, or maybe even related to traditional practices related to women or marriage. I can think of people who've said asking a man asking a father for a woman's hand is so medieval, right? Well, the Register's Europe correspondent Solène Tadié has debunked the bad rap on medieval times, especially when it relates to women and how they fared in the Middle Ages. And Solène Tadié joins us today. She is in Washington, D.C. with Matthew and I in the EWTN. Let me say that again. Solène Tadié is with us in the Washington Bureau, at EWTN's Bureau here, with Matthew and me, and we are in the Guadalupe Radio Network, and very happy to have you here, Solène.
My pleasure. It's good to be here.
In her first time in Washington, so we have to show her this amazing city.
And we put her to work in the studio.
We put her to work in the studio, of course, but it's partially because there's this great story she recently wrote, fantastic story, why feminists should celebrate the Middle Ages and the Catholic Church. So, Solène, why did you choose this topic?
It's a bit of a provocative title, but I think the stakes are high nowadays because there is a misconception of what it means to be a woman. And sometimes I think the new waves of feminism don't understand their past well enough to promote a healthy way of treating women in a society to help them spread their full potential. And I think just to look back at our history and what it used to be like during the Middle Ages can promote a way better or a healthier relationship, a complementarity between male and female. And so, yeah, I think this kind of feminism, that aggressive neo-Marxist approach to feminism does a disservice to society as a whole, but most particularly to women, because it denies their very nature, their biological nature. And in the Middle Age, they were so powerful without ever being denied and, deprived of their very nature.
And you have brought to light in this Register story a scholar, a woman, who had a tremendous life. I mean, she lived from the early 1900s until the 1990s, a huge span of time, a long life. I'm going to butcher this name, it's French, Régine Pernoud. Mm-hmm. But I'd never heard of her before, and reading about her in your story, she really had to overcome intellectual and social bias in the work she did. Please tell us more about Régine.
She was fantastic, and she, like you said, she lived in a very sensitive century, very ideologized century in the academic world. And she resisted despite everything because she was so talented, incredibly smart, and no one could do anything against her because she was an archivist as well, historian. She wrote countless monographs. She was so prolific. And so even left-wing newspapers would interview her all the time because she knew everything about all the great female characters in history. Even the Académie Française awarded her for her lifetime's work. She was, above all, a strong scholar. But then this also pushed her to embrace new theories about the dangers of neo-feminism, mm-hmm. that these currents that were spreading in the 20th century, and she was promoting a healthy return to the pre-patriarchate that was before the French Revolution, before the Renaissance. That was the best period for women to blossom.
She resisted agendas, and there were so mm-hmm. many agendas in the 20th century when it came to women. And tell us, how did she resist this? What did some of her scholarship uncover, facts that she uncovered to resist some of these ideology, as you said.
So she wrote dozens and dozens of books, but the book I really love, and that's the one I quote mostly in my article, is Women in the Times of the Cathedrals, in which she really focuses on the evolution of the role of women in society from the Roman Empire until present days. So it was in the 1980, if I remember correctly, yes. And so basically she claimed that in feudal times, so between the 10th and the 13th century, that's when women had the best rights in history, and they were like queens and powerful women, and even women without any aristocracy, like Joan of Arc, St. Catherine of Siena, became so powerful and could fulfill their destiny, because it was a time where, thanks to Christianity, they were trusted by men.
Absolutely. One fact that you wrote about that really interests me was that in the early church that she studied, and she kind of numbered the number of saints who were men and the number of saints who were women, and women far outnumbered men. And in fact, she said that it was because of women that Christianity spread the way it did. And that just made me excited. And just thinking back to Mary Magdalene as the evangelist to the evangelists, right, to the apostles. And so really, women have this wonderful place. Matthew, did you want to step in?
Yeah, it's that contrast that Jeanette's talking about, the transformation of culture as a result of Christianity. Because one of the complaints I know that you'll get is, well, what about the life of the average woman in the Middle Ages? What was that like?
So what is important, for instance, just a few examples, but women during these feudal times in the Middle Age were they were minors until 12, and boys reached adulthood 2 years later. So women were considered that they have more power, and so they were very active in the intellectual life. All historians agreed on the fact that they read more than men. And so that's also all these period that gave them a lot of strength and the opportunity to arise in the society. And that was a big contrast with ancient time that we tend to glorify nowadays, this Roman law and Roman Empire, where women basically were eternal minors. And they became so during Napoleon in the 19th century with the bourgeois value, they become eternal minors again. And so that's the fact that I agree with those who criticize the 19th century, and I think it's a good thing to free our society from the dross of the 19th century and to go back to a more healthy approach of complementarity between men and women on this model of the Middle Ages. But of course with today's technology in today's world, but with these values.
So how did the Renaissance kind of make us go backwards in a way?
So there was this fascination for the Roman Empire and all of this literature, Roman law again. And during the Roman Empire, women were, fathers had a right of death and life over their daughters, so they had basically no rights at all. And it all changed with the rise of the gospel and the spread of good news, and it changed everything. And during Renaissance, there was this decline of Christianity among society. Then there was the crisis with the Protestantism and everything. But yeah, so basically the church lost ground, and at the same time there was this fascination, this return of this Roman Empire mentality, and that's when women gradually lost their power in universities. They were no longer allowed to become doctors. To study at universities, and so basically we see it as a time of light and after the darkness of the Middle Age. But what Régine Pernoud shows is that the contrary happened for women. That's basically
absolutely, and part of that is how we became so practical, so production-minded, so driven in many ways. That's how society became, and we lost a bit of this. The grounding in the human person and the dignity of each human person, right? And that's not something we think about. We think of rights, but we don't always think of the true dignity of every person, and they're not the same thing. And so I think you're right. We have a long way to recover this golden age and to really understand what it meant to be a woman, to have this complementarity in the Middle Ages, right? And this is a great way, I think your story is a great way to whet people's appetite, right, for this this beautiful expression of femininity in the Middle Ages. Tell us about some of the saints that she highlighted.
So, of course, the example mentioned earlier was impressive for St. Joan of Arc and St. Catherine of Siena, because they were no one. They were born and they were meant to be
peasants.
And they could fulfill an incredible destiny, and they reached the pantheon of all the greatest women in the world. But you have also Hildegard von Bingen, which is that is such an impressive model, because she had a correspondence with all the most powerful men in the world at that time. And she had two secretaries that were men, like monks, and she provided spiritual directions for them. And she was so powerful, so knowledgeable, and she did not represent a threat for anybody. So that was completely different time.
Absolutely, it really was a very different time. I am so grateful that you and I share this fascination with what the Church has offered. Humanity in understanding women and men, right, for our true dignity, our true complementarity, and our giftedness. So keep writing, Solène, on these wonderful topics, please.
I will.
And I want to point our listeners to her story on ncregister.com, Why Feminists Should Celebrate the Middle Ages and the Catholic Church. And you're listening to Register Radio, and you know that you can go to ncregister.com for a lot more news, analysis, and commentary. Thanks for joining us here on Register Radio on EWTN. For Matthew Bunson and today's producer, Michael McCall, I'm Jeanette DeMello. Until next week, I pray God bless you.